two of the wiliest strategists in South African politics, Jacob Zuma and Julius Malema, and their parties, the Sizwe Party and the Economic Freedom Fighters. They're down, but are they out? Will they use this moment of political isolation from power to reconsolidate, reconceptualize, and re-strategize on the way forward, possibly leading to taking power in 2029? Or will they let this moment overturn the progress and the gains that they have made in the MK Party's instance in the last year, and for the EFF in the last 10 years? Will this be a demise, or just another reason for a rise? That's the question that I want to answer in this video. Welcome aboard. I'm Dr. Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh. On this channel, SMWX, the Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh Experience, we explore South African politics through interviews and analysis videos like this. And today I'm giving you a second video today because we have had an important cabinet announcement from President Cyril Ramaphosa. In the first video today, which I would encourage you to watch, I looked at things from the perspective of the government, from the ANC, from the DA, and the parties which make up this coalition. And I promised that today I would look at things from the perspective of the EFF and MK in the second video. And that's exactly what I am going to do. So the first thing I want to look at is, where do the EFF and MK party stand right now? And having looked at where they are, I want to analyze a series of opportunities and threats that both of those parties face, because the opportunities are large, but the threats are also serious. Having done that, I then want to look at some of the questions which remain and some of the contradictions which overhang the governing coalition, and what they need to do to mitigate against the opposition potentially stealing a march on them. So, let's begin with where the EFF and MK are after this crucial election. It's fairly clear to me that it will hurt the EFF and the MK to be this politically isolated. It will hurt both because EFF and MK effectively come from the ANC, and it will hurt because, gotta sip the political tea, it'll hurt because the two parties will have had plans for what they wanted to do if they were in power. Being a political party is always about trying to gain power so that you can implement your proposals and your plans. And so the EFF and the MK party won't be happy that they have effectively been sidelined from any form of governmental power. It'll hurt them, it'll hurt their leaders, it'll hurt their supporters and their followers, who would have been eager to see what these parties could have done if they were able to get their hands on the levers of state. Having said that, in politics, there are always fluid situations in which a party that looks down one minute can be up the next, and vice versa. You only need to look at the ANC that got 39% of the vote and now basically runs the entire government like it never even lost. So that's, I think, where the EFF and the MK are, but they also stand on the cusp of a moment where they, because the opposition ground has been ceded and the DA has left official opposition and has left all this ground to the MK and EFF, they also stand on the cusp of being the only real opposition to this government, this sprawling government which seems to encompass every other political ideology. And that can also be a great opportunity to craft an alternative agenda and set themselves up as the true difference or the distinguishing factor in South African politics, or at least set themselves up in contradistinction to the ANC-DA plus coalition. So, what are the potential threats that lie ahead before we get to the opportunities? Well, first, for the MK party, it's clear that internal coherence and internal stability is one of the key threats. We know that the MK Party has suffered from internal squabbling. Now, interestingly to me, after the election, a certain degree of coherence seems to be emerging within the MK Party. And I think the MK Party is starting to resemble more of its kind of final form, as we see new people joining the party, right from Dr. John Hlophe, all the way to Brian Molefe. It's clear that a certain group who had a great deal of power in the Zuma years, and especially the late Zuma years, are reconsolidating that power base outside the ANC and in this new formation. And those people have been around politics for a very long time, and indeed state power for a very long time, so they know how both of those things work. You've got minds from state-owned enterprises, minds from executive and cabinet, you've got minds from the judiciary. But we know that MK is still fragile and it's still unstable. We saw that with the Jabulani Khumalo incident and leadership debate, which turned really into an internal fight. We know that MK has been prepared to remove leaders. It's removed a whole group of people from its parliamentary list and replaced them with a different group. And like former President Zuma used to govern, he really doesn't mind firing people and moving people around, but that can always create internal backlash. And so the question for the MK Party now is, it needs to get over its teething problems very quickly and prove that it is not just a momentary political miracle, but is actually a true, coherent, long-term political force. And if it can do that, then great. But right now, the jury is still out on whether it will be able to achieve that kind of internal stability and coherence. And what that also means is that the party must be able to develop a new layer of leadership below President Jacob Zuma. It must develop internal and democratic structures. And just as it has done in Parliament by appointing Dr. John Hlophe, it must actually appoint its own internal leaders, maybe provincial structures over a while. It must decide what it wants to be and how it wants to be, and actually bring all of that together as it is trying also to become an official opposition. Now, there will be other difficult moments. There will be former President Zuma's criminal trial, and that could be a moment for mobilization, but it could also be, a difficult moment for the party, because that is going to be a big question for this government. Will they, won't they, really push hard on that? And what does South Africa do if that trial comes to fruition in the term of this government? As for the EFF, well, I think the EFF is a lot more internally stable. However, EFF President Julius Malema himself said that if the party dropped from its previous electoral position, then he would be under pressure. Now, I don't really believe that Julius Malema is under internal pressure in the EFF. I think he's a very secure leader within the EFF, having really been the driving force of that party since its inception. So I don't think he's under any internal threat. However, the bigger threat for the EFF, or the bigger problem, is a certain possible diminishing enthusiasm in the party, in the leadership, also in the supporting ranks. I think people were eyeing this election in this EFF as a kind of coming out election. And I think the EFF would actually have done very well in this election were it not for the MK. I think they had a plan to grow into KZN, where they knew there was great ANC disaffection, and the MK stole a march, just like they stole a march on everyone else. And so in some ways this may feel anticlimactic for EFF supporters, EFF leadership, who really put a lot of work and resources into this election. So how does the EFF then pick itself back up, take some of the disappointment? Many leaders will probably have been eyeing potential government positions, potential opportunity to show what they can do in national portfolios, and the EFF has not got that now. So that sort of mood, I think, is a potential threat for the EFF. And it has always been able to sell the idea that it's growing and it's getting bigger and more opportunities are becoming available. And this election has halted that narrative. Of course, the EFF goes to its National People's Assembly, its big conference, where it will elect leadership for the next 5 years in December. And it'll be interesting to see what happens at that conference. As I say, I think the leadership is relatively settled, but beneath that layer, I think there will be deep debates and deep disagreements in the party, and it'll be important for the party not to allow that conference to descend, but to allow people to air their views and air their disagreements, but ultimately come out united and coherent after that with a new leadership collective. Now, there's also the question of what are the opportunities ahead? And if we turn back to the MK Party, clearly the MK is now the official opposition. And as I say, the space for opposition has been evacuated by many parties that would traditionally take up that space. So the DA would obviously be the biggest opposition party in South Africa, but they have chosen and elected to become part of government, which is quite a risky strategy in the long term for them, ceding opposition ground to EFF and MK. And that offers an opportunity for the parties, firstly, to just take some time, right? The DA and ANC have to deliver now. EFF and MK don't have to be in such a rush. They can sit back, they can strategize, they can think about what they want to do. And I think there are multiple ways in which there are opportunities to be grasped. There are parliamentary opportunities, there are legal opportunities, and there are also opportunities in terms of protest. Now, as far as Parliament is concerned, it seems to me clear that the fulcrum of this governing coalition is President Cyril Ramaphosa. For all the rhetoric of unity, this is ultimately a coalition that unites around Ramaphosa. And the key strategic weakness of this strategy is that Ramaphosa, if he becomes weak, the coalition becomes weak. In other words, if the credibility of Ramaphosa collapses, the coalition collapses. And Ramaphosa enjoys a lot of support and is often able to turn media narratives in his favor, but we know that there are certain weaknesses at the heart of his presidency. One is indecisiveness, another one is the legal and constitutional woes around the Phala scandal, and the other is just a failure to get the economy actually going and basic service delivery really turning around. So what strategies in Parliament, in the courts, and through protest, lawful of course, can these opposition forces test the strength and the credibility of the president and ultimately the governing coalition, right? Another weakness in the governing coalition is, of course, its ideological incoherence. And the fact that I'm pretty sure that behind the scenes, there are deep fights going on about which way this government should go. And we know that the ANC and the DA are themselves almost inherently designed to be in opposition to one another. So it's going to be clear that there are these tensions, and all an opposition movement needs to do is exploit those tensions and make sure that an alternative to those ideological incoherencies can be articulated. So, for example, in Parliament, what happens with Phala? That would seem to be a key question. As the question approaches the Constitutional Court, there's a decision to be made about, do MK and the EFF pounce on this now? Do they wait for the constitutional process to unfold? Do they try to resuscitate the impeachment proceedings, even though Parliament voted against them? Do they do that before or after the Constitutional Court hears the matter? Do they institute parallel proceedings? Do they launch some kind of ad hoc committee to inquire into Phala? And what do they do? Because the Constitution really invests the legislature with wide powers to scrutinize and oversee the executive. So how do opposition parties use their capacity to scrutinize and oversee the executive, which comes from Section 42 and Section 55 of the Constitution? How do they use those powers to lift the lid on not just President Ramaphosa, but wider questions of ANC wrongdoing? Now, what do they do in the courts, of course, because the EFF has launched this constitutional strategy, and I'm interested. Judge Hlophe, for all that people criticize him, is obviously a sophisticated legal thinker and a jurist. And it's very rare that you get someone coming from the highest levels of the judiciary, being a judge president in a very busy and important division, into the political fray. So I'll be interested to see how does Judge Hlophe survey the legal environment and say, well, these are the weaknesses, and these are where we can press on those weaknesses using the courts. This is how we can use the courts to uncover things that will be uncomfortable for the governing coalition. This is how we can challenge questionable decisions in court. And clearly, the EFF has long had a sophisticated legal strategy, which goes all the way back to constitutional court actions like the Nkandla case, the secret ballot case, the impeachment case. So combined with the MK, I would be interested to see how they are able to wield the legal strategies at their disposal to present an effective and efficient opposition voice. Furthermore, so for example, that is, if the government launches a controversial policy action, which is actually causing internal division within the government, then you take the government to court and you force it to defend itself. And that means that internal discussions in the government become very difficult because you get factions on either side and that kind of thing. Obviously, if you disagree, you don't just have an agenda to destabilize the government for its own sake. It's about being an effective opposition. Furthermore, there's the question of peaceful and lawful protest, which has always been within an arrow in the quiver of opposition politics. In fact, the DA has done very provocative marches to Luthuli House. Now, I'm not suggesting that MK or EFF should do that, but there is an extent to which protest and popular protest has to form part of opposition to the government. We've seen in South Africa how peaceful protest does put the government under pressure to act, and because there's not much media pressure on the government or civil society pressure, it's clear that pressure will probably have to come from some combination of parliamentary strategy, legal strategy, and popular protest strategy. At the same time, that could be a danger because you only want to wield popular protest in ways that are in fact popular, that are lawful, and you don't want things to go out of control, in which case then you become liable for that. Ultimately, and here's the big strategic question. If we look at the EFF and the MK, even though individually they're relatively small compared to the ANC, when you combine those two forces, you get 25%, a quarter of the electorate, a quarter of parliament, a quarter of political power. Right. Now, there is a question as to whether the ANC itself can remain united when it goes into a coalition with the DA. And it's very clear to me that there is a strand of opposition internally inside the ANC to this deal with the DA. There's a strand in COSATU and in the union movement. There's a strand in the SACP. There's a strand within the radical tradition of the ANC. Now, I don't know how big that strand is, but the thing is that the ANC can't afford any more splits, right? It's already down to 39%. So if EFF and MK can break away yet another chunk of the ANC and bring that over to their sphere of influence to the extent that they're going to work together, then you have a force that's going from 25% maybe to 30%, right? If they can break away just another 5%. And then what you really have is you've broken South Africa into three poles, right? It's no longer the big ANC and then the small DA and the smaller parties. What you then have is you've got an ANC at 35, you've got EFF MK at 30, and you've got the rest, making up the balance. And so you've kind of broken South African politics up into kind of 3/3 in a way. Now, then you would have a very powerful counterweight, right? Because you would have a third instead of a quarter. And so the question, I think, for those parties which purport to be on the progressive end of the spectrum is, to what extent can they collaborate and unite and bring a certain element of the ANC within them? And you could see various forms of, even in the long term, merging happening or cooperation happening, or maybe even convincing the ANC that they should merge back into the ANC. So there are all kinds of permutations. Now, I just want to turn attention then quickly to the ANC and DA again. As I said, I've made a video about these parties and the governing coalition in the first video released today, so check that out as well. But it seems clear as well that there is only one option for this ANC-DA plus coalition. It's deliver or die. Because if this government cannot deliver tangible economic service delivery, even social justice gains in fairly short order, South Africans are going to grow very tired of it very quickly. Right now, this government is living in an afterglow. It's got a great deal of goodwill behind it, and it's in a short honeymoon period. I give that honeymoon period about 2 weeks. After that, this government will have to demonstrate that it is cohering, that its internal processes are up to shape, and that it is running, not walking. And it's a very difficult thing to do with a government this big and unwieldy, but this is the government that Cyril Ramaphosa and the ANC chose, and so now they must make it work. When you think about it, for example, I watched Helen Zilla's recent interview on Newsroom Africa with Aldrin Sampear. Shout out to Aldrin for an excellent interview. And it seems very clear to me that the DA is not fully united on this decision to join the government, and in some ways rightly so, because the ANC really left the DA with crumbs. If you look at this government, the DA sacrificed its proportional representation. Out of 30 ministries or so, it's got 6, and 6 deputy ministries, which is really nothing compared to its size. And remember that the ANC needed the DA to create this government, unless they were going to go into some unwieldy multi-party arrangement. So I think some in the DA are really against this move, or at least very skeptical about it when all is said and done. And so this government's going to have to deliver both to convince the DA that it should stay and the ANC that it should stay. And there's just no way around it. This government cannot spin itself into success. And this is why I worry that this national dialogue, which seems to be their first opening move, is completely wrong-headed. Because what we don't need is a government that's dialoguing and taking steps back and relaxing and talking and trying to figure itself out. We need a government that identifies priorities, tells the nation what those priorities are, and gives us regular, if not daily, updates on where we are on those priorities. And then shows us tangibly that it has delivered on those priorities, whether it's education, healthcare, load shedding, logistics, land reform, transformation of the economy, poverty, unemployment, inequality. We need to see those things moving and moving now. And if this government is going to sit back and try and figure out, we'll agree on 60% but not 60%, and let's have a national dialogue to talk about all the issues that we already know exist, and come up with some wishy-washy document that has no legal standing to resolve them, it's just wrong-headed. This government must just tell us its priorities. We've had an election, which was a national dialogue, and now the people have said, go out there and deliver on the promises you made. Find the shared promises, know what they are, and deliver on them. And if the government can do that, and if the ANC and DA can do that, it's a very potent political force, and it's a potent message, because the ANC can say, we bring our liberation history. The DA can say, we bring our purported capacity to govern efficiently, and we combine those things so that you have social justice and you have clean government at the same time. You can have your cake and eat it. But that's only if they're able to govern, because the alternative is the worst of all worlds, where we get the worst of ANC corruption, the worst of DA arrogance and racism, and none of the government and governance in between that makes any sense to any of those two parties or the electorate. And we get log jams and butting of heads and squabbles day in and day out, and no decisions being made. So this government, the only way it cannot offer gifts to the opposition, the EFF and MK, who will gladly pounce if gifts are offered, is to make sure that it delivers, and delivers fairly soon, and fairly quickly, and urgently, and very tangibly. So that brings an end to the immediate review of the cabinet announcement. I've looked at it from the government perspective. I've now looked at it from the opposition perspective. Please make sure that you subscribe to this channel. We're on a mission to reach 200,000 subscribers by the end of this year. Just, if you're riding with us to the end of this video, the aim of this channel is just to give you a different perspective on South African politics. I am not a member of any political party, but I try to make sure that I give you a perspective that's different to what you'll read in News 24, Daily Maverick, or watch on the public broadcaster, or anything like that. I'm not saying this perspective is always right, or that you should only watch this channel. You should consume a wide variety of digital media and mainstream media, but I can assure you that we will always strive here to be one of the deepest places you can go for understanding South African politics. Thanks for riding with us on SMWX. Make sure you keep it locked on this channel, and I'll see you in the comments and on the next installment. Spread the fire. Ayeye.